Losers almost never admit they lost. They rewrite the game. They wanted money. Now money is evil. They wanted love. Now relationships are overrated. They wanted success. Now successful people are shallow. They wanted to be respected. Now anyone who cares about status is insecure. They wanted the life someone else had. They couldn't get it. So eventually, they decided they never wanted it in the first place. And here's the uncomfortable part. Sometimes they're telling the truth, but sometimes they're protecting themselves. Because losing hurts. Changing the rules hurts less. And Nietzsche spent a lot of time thinking about why human beings do exactly this. Because sometimes the easiest way to deal with losing is to convince yourself that winning was never worth it. But here's the first disturbing part. You don't actually have to stop wanting something to resent it. You can still want it and hate it at the same time. Think about someone you know, someone who always has an explanation. Money isn't everything. Success doesn't matter. Relationships are a trap. People with ambition are just compensating for something. People who are rich are miserable. People who are attractive are shallow. People who are confident are arrogant. And people who have what they want, well, they're probably not happy anyway. You know the type. And maybe you've already thought of someone. Good. Keep them in mind. Because this is where Nietzsche's idea gets uncomfortable. Imagine you want something, really want it. Money, success, love, respect, whatever it is, you try and you fail. You try again, you fail again. Eventually, you face a question that your ego absolutely hates. What if I am the problem? Maybe you weren't disciplined enough. Maybe you weren't talented enough. Maybe you made the wrong decisions. Maybe someone else simply worked harder. That's a painful possibility. So your mind offers you an alternative. What if the thing you wanted wasn't actually worth wanting? Now you have a solution. You don't have to improve. You don't have to try again. You don't have to risk failing again. You just have to change the value of the thing you couldn't obtain. I think of this as value inversion. You wanted something. You couldn't get it. So instead of changing yourself, you change what the thing means. You wanted money. Now money is corrupt. You wanted a relationship. Now relationships are a trap. You wanted success. Now successful people are miserable. The goal didn't disappear. You changed its value. But here's what's strange. You might still want it. You just don't want to admit that you do. Because admitting you still want something you failed to get means admitting the failure still has power over you. And sometimes it's easier to say, I never wanted it, than to say, I wanted it badly and I couldn't get it. And suddenly, losing doesn't feel quite so much like losing. Nietzsche had a word for a particular version of this, ressentiment. And it's not simply resentment, it's what happens when you feel powerless against something you desire. You can't get it. You can't defeat the person who has it. You can't change your position. So you change the meaning of the thing itself. Nietzsche described resentment as becoming creative, and that's what makes it so dangerous. Because resentment doesn't always stay resentment. It can become a philosophy. It can become morality. It can become a worldview. This is where resentment and value inversion connect. First, you can't have what you want. Then you change the value of what you wanted. But sometimes that isn't enough. You don't just decide the thing is worthless. You decide the thing is wrong. You can't have what someone else has? Fine. Now what they have is bad. You can't be as successful? Fine. Now success is shallow. You can't command respect? Fine. Now people who seek respect are narcissists. You can't win the game? Fine. Now the game is corrupt. The thing you couldn't obtain doesn't just become undesirable. It becomes immoral. And the person who has been losing suddenly gets to feel morally superior to the person who won. That's the genius of it. You haven't changed your circumstances, but you've changed the story. And sometimes that's enough to make you feel like you won. But here's another twist. Resentment doesn't always look like anger. Sometimes it looks like wisdom. Sometimes it looks like morality. Sometimes it sounds like the most reasonable person in the room. And that's precisely what makes it dangerous. Because if resentment looked like resentment, you'd recognize it. The most effective defense doesn't feel like a defense. It feels like the truth. Imagine someone who spends 10 years trying to become a musician. They practice, they write songs, they play tiny clubs, they send demos. Nothing happens. Meanwhile, they watch people they think are less talented become successful. They keep trying. Nothing changes. Eventually, they quit. At first, they say they're taking a break. Then they say the music industry is fake. Then they say popular music is garbage. Then they start laughing at people who dream about becoming musicians. Eventually, they've built an entire philosophy around why they were right to quit. Maybe they genuinely discovered that music wasn't for them. That's possible. But maybe something else happened. Maybe they couldn't bear the possibility that they failed. So they found a way to make quitting feel like a victory. And this is where the psychology becomes interesting. Because here's the disturbing part. Your mind isn't trying to deceive you. It thinks it's helping. It doesn't say, I'm protecting you from the pain of failure. It says, I'm telling you the truth. That's why self-deception works. The best defenses don't feel like lies. They feel like clarity. This is what Isaiah Berlin's idea of the inner citadel helps us understand. When the outside world becomes too difficult to control, you retreat into a world you can control. You can't change reality. Change your interpretation of reality. You can't reach the mountain. Decide climbing mountains is stupid. You couldn't win. Decide winning is meaningless. You couldn't get the relationship. Decide relationships are overrated. You couldn't make money. Decide money is corrupt. And suddenly, you're safe. Nothing can disappoint you anymore. Because you've created a world where the things you failed to achieve no longer matter. But here's the strange thing. Sometimes you don't destroy the desire. You just build a world where the desire is no longer allowed to matter. And that's a very different thing. Because the desire might still be there, buried underneath the explanation, waiting. And sometimes that story is wisdom. Sometimes you've genuinely discovered that you wanted the wrong thing. But sometimes you've just built a very comfortable prison. Now here's where this idea becomes dangerous. Because by now you've probably thought of someone who does exactly this. Someone who always has an excuse. Someone who criticizes everything they couldn't achieve. Someone who says money doesn't matter, success doesn't matter. Relationships don't matter, status doesn't matter. You've probably thought, yeah, I know exactly who this is about. Good, now forget them. Because Nietzsche wasn't writing about your neighbor, he wasn't writing about your annoying coworker, he wasn't writing about the person you secretly think is a loser, he was writing about you, and me, and everyone else. Because here's the trap. The easiest person in the world to diagnose is someone who isn't you. The frightening thing about resentment is that you can experience it without ever noticing. Your mind doesn't announce, I'm about to protect your ego. It says, I'm telling the truth. And suddenly, the person you criticize becomes the problem. Their success becomes proof of their greed. Their confidence becomes proof of their arrogance. Their ambition becomes proof of their insecurity. Maybe it is, but what if it isn't? What if you're not criticizing them because they're wrong? What if you're criticizing them because they remind you of something you haven't become? Now the question changes. It's no longer, why are they coping? It's, what am I protecting myself from? But here's another problem. What if the person criticizing them is coping too? Imagine someone says, successful people are just lucky. Maybe they're resentful, but then someone immediately responds, you're just jealous. Maybe they're resentful too. The first person might be protecting themselves from their failure. The second might be protecting themselves from the possibility that the criticism is true. Now you're trapped because you can't simply point at someone and say, you're coping. You have to look inward, and that's much harder because you can become so obsessed with identifying resentment in other people that you start resenting anyone who doesn't agree with you. Now you're doing the exact thing you're accusing them of. You just gave it a different name. Picture this. A man sits alone in his car outside a restaurant. Through the window, he can see a group of old friends laughing around a table. One of them just got promoted. Another just bought a house. Someone is showing photos of a newborn baby. He watches for a moment. Then he looks down at his phone. A message pops up from one of those friends. You should have come in, man. He stares at it. Types, nah, I'm good. deletes it, types, "Honestly, I don't even like those people anymore," sends it. And for a moment, he feels better, not because anything changed, but because he found a story that made staying outside feel like a choice. Maybe he genuinely didn't want to go inside. Or maybe he wanted to be invited badly enough that being left out hurt. And the story was easier than the truth. Sometimes the mind doesn't remove the pain. It gives the pain a reason. Because if the problem is the world, you're powerless. If the problem is bad luck, you're innocent. If the problem is corrupt people, you're justified. But if the problem is you, now you have responsibility. And responsibility is uncomfortable, so sometimes the mind chooses the explanation that hurts the least. It wasn't worth it anyway. But maybe that's the question we should be asking about ourselves. Not, who's right, but which parts of my worldview did I actually choose, and which parts did I build because reality forced me to? This is why Nietzsche's idea of master and slave morality goes deeper than simply saying poor people resent rich people. That's a crude interpretation. On the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche was asking a much bigger question. Where did our ideas of good and evil come from? Sometimes values aren't created from strength or freedom. Sometimes they're created in reaction to what we feel powerless against. If you can't defeat strength, you can call strength oppressive. If you can't achieve ambition, you can call ambition greed. If you can't obtain power, you can call power evil. And suddenly, you don't have to ask, how did they become that? You can simply say, I don't want to be like them. Problem solved. But here's where Nietzsche could also turn the knife back on himself. Because how do we know that our moral judgments are free from resentment? How do we know we're not doing the exact same thing? Maybe the person who hates success is coping, but maybe the person obsessed with success is coping too. Maybe one is protecting themselves from failure, and the other is protecting themselves from emptiness. Suddenly, Nietzsche's question gets much harder, because the problem isn't simply that some people resent success. The problem is that all of us are capable of creating stories that protect us from reality. And sometimes the story is true. That's what makes this so difficult. You can be right about someone else and still be lying to yourself. You've probably heard someone say, money won't make you happy. And they're right. You can become rich and still be miserable. You can become famous and still be lonely. You can get the relationship and still feel empty. External success doesn't automatically solve internal problems. But there's another possibility. Sometimes, when people say, it won't make you happy anyway, they're giving you wisdom. And sometimes they're giving themselves permission to stop trying. Both things can sound exactly the same. That's why you have to look deeper. You can want money without believing money is everything. You can want success without worshipping success. You can want a relationship without believing another person will complete you. You can recognize the limits of external achievement without pretending external achievement has no value. Because sometimes, I don't need it is freedom. And sometimes, it's surrender wearing the mask of wisdom. So here's the question. What have you secretly wanted that you've convinced yourself you don't want anymore? What did you once dream about? What did you once envy? What did you once believe would change your life? And what happened? Did you genuinely outgrow the desire? Or did you just get tired of failing to achieve it? Because those two things can sound exactly the same. You can lose and learn. You can lose and adapt. You can lose and try again. Or you can lose and build an entire philosophy around your loss. You turn your weakness into virtue, your failure into wisdom, your resentment into morality. And eventually, you become so good at explaining why you don't need the thing that you forget you ever wanted it. That's when failure stops being an event and becomes an identity. So the next time you hear yourself say, I don't want that anymore, maybe you really don't, but ask yourself one question. Did I outgrow the desire, or did I just get tired of failing to achieve it? Because one is freedom, and the other is a prison you built yourself.